Ross. Well, hopefully after that introduction, I can live up to the image of me that Ross has built up for you. It will be challenging. So this talk sort of summarizes work that we've been doing in my group for the last maybe 5 years or so. Some of you, actually, there are a lot of you that used to be in other institutions are now here at UW. And so some of you have seen versions of parts of this talk at different times. But I promise that for all of you, at least 50% of the material will be new. Some of you, the percentage might be higher. That's right, that's right. Left child, all the same, right? Actually, no, it's more like the second and fourth grandchildren are new. This talk is basically about, a lot of my work has basically been about asking this question of, in compilers, in the world of HPC, we've known what to do for what we call regular programs for a very long time. And when we say regular, we mean programs that deal with dense matrices and dense arrays, the kinds of things that you might see in linear algebra, the kinds of things you might see in stencil codes and things like that. And the nice thing about dense matrices and dense arrays is that it's very easy, or not easy, I don't want to say that. It is possible to reason about what applications do when they manipulate these arrays and matrices, because you can analyze the loops that iterate over them. You can analyze the access functions that get into the matrices and arrays to figure out where dependencies might arise, what kinds of computations you're doing, what sorts of access patterns you have. And as a result, over 30 plus years of work, we've come up with a tremendous number of transformations for improving the locality and parallelism of regular programs. These are transformations that you might have seen in various introductory classes, things like loop tiling, loop interchange, loop skewing, stuff like that. And they work really well for regular programs. The problem is that as soon as you step away from dense matrices and dense arrays, as soon as you move to what we call irregular programs, and in the compiler world we like to think of everything else as being irregular, this stops being true. Right? You no longer have nice dense matrices and arrays that you're indexing into with nice affine index expressions that you can reason about using things like ILP solvers. You no longer have nice dense for loops that have very nicely, easily representable iteration spaces. It suddenly becomes much harder to reason about these programs and hence much harder to analyze and optimize these programs. And there's many things that make this hard, but I think I want to boil it down to a couple of specific things when we're talking about irregular programs, in particular programs that deal with pointer-based data structures. One is that the behavior of these programs tends to be very, very input dependent. Right? The particular kind of tree or graph that you're dealing with depends on your input, and that inherently makes it hard for a compiler to reason about what's going on. The access patterns become very hard to reason about. Which parts of the tree or which parts of the graph I'm accessing become hard to reason about. Where exactly the data is becomes hard to reason about, right? You're at the mercy of your memory allocator to figure out where things in your data structure happen to be laid out. And that means that it can be hard to find locality, it can be hard to schedule for parallelism, it can be hard to represent other ways of executing the same program. It's just in general hard to deal with these applications. And because irregular is sort of defined as everything that's not regular, it's not even clear that there are common opportunities, common things that we can exploit in these kinds of programs in order to improve locality, improve parallelism, etc. And so our work in my group for the last several years has been about finding common ground. And in order to answer this question of are there common patterns in irregular programs, the first thing we had to do was stop trying to be everything to everyone and say, OK, we can't handle every possible irregular application out there. Let's focus on a subset of these applications that we can reason about more easily, a subset that might actually have some structure that we can exploit, a subset that we can define well enough that we can actually come up with some good transformations to optimize the programs. And so we specifically targeted recursive traversal applications. So these are applications that recursively traverse data structures like trees and DAGs and graphs. Although primarily I'll be focusing on trees here. And through that narrowing of focus over the last several years, we've developed a bunch of different things, including a transformation that we call point blocking. This is the moral analog of loop tiling, except for trees. An analysis that we call tree dependence analysis. This is like the first step towards doing a polyhedral analysis for trees. More transformations, traversal splicing, which does a different kind of tiling, vectorization, so a nice parallelization transformation, which if you've ever tried to vectorize programs that deal with pointer-based data structures, you know that's not so easy. And Actually, as a result of doing all of this work, we kind of went off in a little bit of a left turn and came up with some interesting ideas for how to vectorize task parallel applications, which doesn't seem like something you should even be able to do, since vector computation is all about data parallelism, and task parallelism is task parallelism. So these are the things I'm going to talk to you about today. And the key insight that drove all of this, that made all of this work, is that at least in this particular subset of irregular programs, there's enough regularity, there are enough common patterns that we can identify and exploit in order to improve locality, parallelism, etc. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be telling you about today. These are the different pieces of the talk. But before I do any of that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in what I mean when I'm talking about recursive traversal applications. So let me tell you about one specific algorithm that's a nice exemplar algorithm. It's nice because it fits on one slide when I show you the pseudocode. Okay, so this is an application called point correlation or two-point correlation. It's a data mining algorithm. It's basically something that tells you something about how clustered a data set is. If you're interested, there was a supercomputing paper a couple years ago that I was either nominated for or won the Gordon Bell Prize talking about how to do this at very, very large scale. So these are the kinds of things that people are interested in dealing with very large data sets and running this kind of analysis. Okay? And the idea behind point correlation is the following. So given a set of points in k dimensions, so this is points in 2 dimensions, and a point p, so this blue point here, p, I want to find all the points that are within some radius r of p. Right? This is a classic n-body problem. And so here the answer is 2. And of course, the higher this number is, the more clustered the points are. The lower the number is, the less clustered the points are. And the naive approach here, the one that, if you were to give this to a first semester programming student to write, they'd be like, oh, this is a great opportunity to use this doubly nested loop pattern I just learned about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate over every point and compare to every other point in the data set, compute the distance between them, and compute the correlation for every point. This, unsurprisingly, is really slow when you're talking about millions or billions of points. So a better approach is to use what's called a spatial acceleration structure, or a spatial tree, in this case a KD tree, and build that tree and traverse that tree in order to accelerate the process of figuring out that there are 2 points near this blue point. So let me show you how that works. A spatial tree basically takes a space, like a metric space, and recursively subdivides it and captures what you can think of as actual spatial locality between points, not spatial locality like you might see in memory, but actual spatial locality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a box, like a bounding box of all these points. I'll call that node A, and I'll keep subdividing it into smaller subspaces. Right? So I'll split the space into 2, create nodes B and G, and keep doing this. So I'm basically going to build this tree structure where every node of the tree represents a subspace, and the leaves of the tree are each subspaces that have just 1 point in them, or some small number of points in them. Okay? So how does this tree structure help me solve point correlation? It works as follows. I take my point, I start at the top node, and I ask, does that circle intersect that box? If it does, that means that there's a chance that there's some point in the subspace that is inside the circle. Right? If the answer is yes, I just keep recursing. So now I look at node B, and there's actually no way that there's any point in subspace B that is inside that circle. Right? And I can tell this by just doing a really quick check. I only have to look at node B. And by doing so, I can immediately prune that entire half of the search space. So I can just cut off searching half of the space. Right? And now I can move over to node G and keep working my way down the list, or down the tree. When I get to a leaf node, I actually do a direct comparison with the point. So here's the first point that is in the circle. Here's the second point that's in the circle. Now, this is not an exact process. I still have to do a direct comparison with this point, even though the point is not actually in the circle because the subspace intersects, but not a big deal. Ultimately, what that means is that to find the correlation for this point, instead of having to compare with every other point in the space, I can just do this log n, essentially, computation. Right? But what I had to do was traverse this tree in order to do so. Okay? And point correlation says do this for every point. Okay, I want to know how clustered the data set is, so I need to know this for every point. And the code for point correlation is simple enough that I can put it on a single slide. So first I build the KD tree. That's actually not that simple, so I won't show you that. But I build the KD tree, and then I take some set of points and a radius, and then I say for every point in the set of points, recursively traverse that tree. As I recursively traverse that tree, I just check the bounding box to see whether I have to stop the recursion. If I do, I just return. Otherwise, if I'm at a leaf, I do the direct comparison. Otherwise, I keep going, making my way down the tree. Right? And this basic pattern that we see here in point correlation actually shows up over and over and over again in a surprising number of domains. Right? So it shows up in data mining, not just in point correlation, but in nearest neighbor applications. It shows up in simulation. So if anybody's familiar with like the Barnes hut or various tree code approaches to doing n-body simulations, This is what happens there. It shows up in graphics. A lot of ray tracers, for a lot of different reasons, traverse trees. And the basic pattern is this. I have some recursive traversal. I have some recursive structure that I'm traversing. And I'm doing it a lot. Okay? So this is the basic pattern that we're going to target. This is what our recursive traversal applications are going to look like. And what's nice about this from a locality standpoint is I've got a whole bunch of points that are traversing the same tree, which means that there's definitely some data reuse here, which means if I could do a better job of doing these traversals, I might be able to get really good performance. OK, but before I actually figure out what it means to do a better job of traversing the tree, I need to first be able to reason about what these traversals are doing in the first place. And irregular traversals are really tricky because there's a lot of pointer chasing going on. There's this recursion I have to deal with. But fundamentally, all of that pointer chasing and recursion, basically these two lines of code, this is really the moral equivalent of a for loop. Right? It's just saying iterate over the tree. And sometimes I stop iterating because I truncate. But essentially, I'm saying iterate over the tree. So why don't I just ignore all the stuff that makes this really ugly and throw away the recursion, throw away the pointer chasing, and just suppose I could ask an oracle. Right? I have a point. For every point in the set, ask the oracle what part of the tree I'm going to touch, and then iterate over that tree, over those set of nodes. Right? And so this is my new code. It looks like a nice doubly nested loop. Right? Every point asks the oracle what they want to interact with, and then they go off and interact with those nodes of the tree. Right? This program, doubly nested loop, touches exactly the same nodes of the tree. Of course, I've basically buried all of the recursion in the oracle, but we'll be able to ignore that, as we'll see. But now that I have a doubly nested loop, I can turn to the compiler writer's favorite abstraction for dealing with loops, which is iteration spaces. Okay, so the way iteration spaces work is if I've got a two-dimensional iteration space, I'm going to put one dimension along each axis. So the y dimension here represents the points that need to traverse the tree. The x dimension represents the nodes of the tree. And every point visits some set of nodes of the tree. And I can basically think about my entire computation, the entire program, as a bunch of these bubbles that represent one of those interaction executions for a particular point at a particular node in the tree. Okay, this is my computation. This is the entire program. Okay? In fact, what point 2 does when it visits nodes A, then B, then G, H, I, J, and K, that's the traversal that we saw in our original example. Okay? And iteration spaces are great because they let us reason about the program, and they also let us reason about anything else we might want to do to the program. Because any other kind of optimization we might want to do for locality, I can think about as basically just being a rescheduling of this computation. I have a particular computation. I've got a particular set of computations that need to happen. Right? Those will have to happen, but there are many different orders in which they can happen. And different orders can give me different behaviors. Right? Better locality, better parallelism, or worse locality and worse parallelism. Right? But I can now think about everything I want to do is rescheduling these computations. So if I want to schedule for better locality, first I need to think about what locality means, what good locality means here. And so what I'm going to do is use reuse distance or stack distance. This basically, if you're not familiar with it, says between the use and reuse of a particular location in memory, count how many other unique locations in memory I've touched. Not the total number of accesses I do, but the unique locations that I touch. This basically gives me a measure of locality because stack distance is essentially what an LRU, a fully associative LRU cache would do. The smaller the reuse distance, the more likely it is that something is still going to be in cache when I come back around and see it. So for example, if I take node C here and count up how many other unique nodes in the tree I touch before I come back around and see that node again. So between when 1 visits C and when 3 visits C, I see that I've visited 10 different nodes. My reuse distance is 10. I'm ignoring everything else because this makes it simpler. I'm only going to think about the tree nodes, but I've visited 10 other nodes. OK, so what are some scheduling games that we can play? Well, one thing that we can do is we can say, well, I've got this loop that's saying for every point, go and traverse this tree. But there's no reason I actually need to do them in this particular order. Right? I don't need to do point 1, then point 2, then point 3. They're all independent of each other. So one thing I could do is reorder the points. Suppose I do them in a different order. Here's a new schedule of computation. I'm going to do points 1, 3, and 5 first, and then 2 and 4. Right? So I'm going to do them in a slightly different order. Brand new schedule of computation. Right? Essentially what I've done is I've reordered that outer loop of points. And when I do that, I can once again reason about reuse distance. And now my reuse distance for C has gone down to 6. Right? 1, 3, and 5 all do very similar traversals of the tree. So by grouping them together, I've improved my reuse distance. I've made it more like I'm reusing more of the tree with each traversal. And in general, going from a bad order to a good order takes your reuse distance from being on the order of the size of the tree, which, as you can imagine, is terrible, to on the order of the size of a traversal, which is much smaller. Right? It's going from n to log n. Now the problem is that these traversals still get very big. When I'm talking about billions of points, these traversals are traversing very large trees, and my reuse distances still get big. And so what happens when they get larger? Well, it's hard to think about what happens with a bigger tree because I can't draw it up on this slide. But let's instead think about having a small cache. Right? Suppose my cache were only big enough to hold 4 tree nodes at a time. Right? Really small cache. What happens is that I bring C into my cache, then I bring D into my cache, E and F, and then when I bring G into my cache, I have to kick C out of the cache, because I haven't accessed it in a while. And in fact, I get worst case behavior. Right? If my reuse distance is bigger than my cache size, that's going to be a miss. And every node in this computation has a bad reuse distance. I get worst case behavior, even though there's a tremendous amount of reuse here. Even though I'm accessing the same parts of the tree over and over and over again, this schedule gives me very poor locality. I get worst case behavior, lots of cache misses. So what can we do about this? Well, let's simplify a little bit more. Right? So let's just play a game. Let's abstract away a bit more. When the points are sorted, right? So when I went from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, the difference between consecutive traversals has gotten relatively small, right? Most of the time between one traversal and the next one, there's a lot of similarity between the two traversals. So for the purposes of abstraction, let's just ignore the fact that there's any difference at all. Okay? So rather than asking the oracle for every point, let's just assume that every point does sort of the same thing. Right? So every traversal is sort of the same. So for each point P in PS, for each tree node T in TS, now the same TS, do this interaction. Okay? So here's my new super abstract computation. And what's interesting is that the behavior of this really abstracted computation is exactly the same as the behavior of a regular dense linear algebra operation, which is vector outer product, taking 2 vectors and multiplying them together to get a matrix. Okay? Just to sort of show how that works, I just iterate over PS and TS, and I interact between the 2 entries in those vectors. If I think of those as arrays, in terms of what parts of PS and TS I'm accessing, that's like saying A of ij is equal to PS of I times TS of j, which is just computing outer product. Okay? And now I can think about what the locality behavior of outer product is. Well, it turns out that the locality behavior of outer product is exactly the same as for this tree code. I only get cold misses on the points. I basically bring a point into cache, and then I get to stick with the same point while I go through the entire tree array, or the entire tree, as the case may be. But if my tree is big, if my TS vector is big, I get capacity misses on every single access to TS. Because by the time I come back around, it's already been kicked out of cache. OK. So vector outer product is actually a pretty nice, convenient abstraction for what's going on here. What do we do to get good locality in vector outer product? Right? I said at the beginning of the talk that people have been looking at dense linear algebra applications for 30+ years and optimizing them to get good locality and parallelism. What do people actually do? Well, they do a bunch of loop transformations. They basically restructure the loops to get different behaviors. So what could we do? Well, one thing we could try to do is interchange the 2 loops. Right? Put the TS loop on the outside and the PS loop on the inside. That actually doesn't help us any. All it does is it changes where we're getting good locality. Now we're going to get capacity misses on every access to a point. And we're going to get great locality in the T array, but that doesn't help us. Right? We're still getting the same number of capacity misses per iteration. OK. But nobody actually does interchange to get good locality in vector outer product. What do people actually do to get good locality in vector outer product? They do loop tiling. What does loop tiling look like? It does this. I'm going to grab a block of PS, and then I'm going to take a single node or single thing from TS, and then for every element of the block, I'm going to do my interaction. And then I'm going to move to the next block, and the next block, and the next block. Okay? That's what I do to get good locality in vector outer product. And I can actually sort of unfold all my levels of abstraction and see what it should look like if I'm actually talking about trees. What I'm going to do in the tree is I'm going to take a block of points, and then for every node in the tree, ask the oracle what parts of the tree this block needs to traverse. Right? So what parts of the tree any of the points in this block need to traverse, and then iterate over those parts of the tree and interact with them. Okay? So because we're dealing with blocks of points, we call this point blocking. Okay? And here's what it does to our iteration space. Here's what it does to our schedule. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a block of points 1, 3, and 5, and have them all interact with A. Then they'll all go down and interact with B. They'll all go down and interact with C. When I get to node D, remember I have to go to any part of the tree that any point in the block wants to visit. So I go to D, and 1 and 3 interact with D. They interact with E, F, and G. When I get to H, just 5. Nobody wants to go to I and J, so I get to skip all of I and J and move over to K. Right? And then I move on to the next block, 2 and 4. OK, so this is the schedule that I would like. And why is this schedule good? Well, here's the intuition. I'm going to miss on each tree node once per block. Every time a block visits a tree node, the tree is big enough that I'm going to get a miss. Right? So I'm going to miss on each tree node once per block. But that's better than once per point, which is what was happening before. And as long as this block fits in cache, I only get cold misses on the points anyway. So I haven't made anything worse for my points. So I've basically just reduced my misses by a factor of b by doing this. Now, this is the schedule that I want. One problem in any compiler transformation, and this is one of actually the big challenges in the polyhedral world, is when I come up with a new schedule, I need to actually be able to generate code that implements that schedule efficiently. Right? I can't just give you some arbitrary schedule and say, go run those things. I need to have some efficient way of realizing this schedule. And what's interesting is that there's a very efficient way of realizing the schedule. In fact, I can show it to you on a single slide. This was our original point blocking code. Right? For each point recurses through the tree. This is the transformed code. So here's what has happened. I'm now iterating with blocks of points instead of a single point. The recursive function now accepts blocks of points instead of a single point. If there's no points left in the block, it's basically like the oracle is telling us nobody wants to visit this part of the tree, so I can just return. Otherwise, for every point in the block, this red code is just the original loop body, or the original recursive function body. Right? I compare to the node, I check if it's a leaf, I do the correlation. And if I want to continue recursing, I just add it to a next block. Right? I'd sort of defer the recursion. So basically, all the points interact with the current node. Anybody that wants to keep going gets added to the next block, and then I pass the next block down the tree. And this code implements that schedule. Right? So this is actually simple enough that we can put it all into a source-to-source compiler. Right? We can recognize the original traversal pattern, then rewrite the code to look like this. OK, so really quick experimental evaluation. So this was on a big system, but I'm only going to show you one core numbers. This is a locality transformation. I only really care about locality, so I'm just going to look at single core numbers. Rest assured that this parallelizes really nicely. So we looked at 6 different tree benchmarks with different kinds of inputs, because these are all input-dependent programs. So we have a total of 15 benchmark and input pairs. This was all done in Java, so this was sort of old stuff. There's a lot of numbers here. In the interest of time, I just want to show you the punchline, which is the geometric mean here. So we get a 50% speed up when we do auto-tuning. We get a sort of a 75% speed up in our best case. So what is the difference between the best case and the auto-tuning? Well, remember I said that I get good locality as long as the block fits in cache. So I need to find a good block size. If my block size is too big, I get a lot of misses because my block doesn't fit in cache. If my block size is too small, I get a lot of misses because I miss in the tree once per block. So more blocks is bad. OK, so I want the biggest block size possible, but no bigger. If we pick the best block size, this is the performance we get. If we do auto-tuning, which basically at runtime searches for the best block size, we lose a little bit of performance, but we still do pretty well. OK, so that's point blocking. Right, this was the first scheduling transformation that we came up with. It's basically the analog of loop tiling, except for trees. Any questions?
Tiling and interchange. Or
well, so the way to think about...
Sorry, not loop interchange, but you still have to sort the rows. Right?
That's right. There's still the sorting issue, which we'll talk about later. That's right. So the sorting is necessary, but even if you don't sort, you can still get some benefits out of doing this.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, the sorting is a big important piece. OK. So, Russ.
Why are you tuning at runtime?
So we tune at runtime because what you actually want. So if you look at the way this code works, right? The block that starts the traversal out here is not that size. Doesn't stay the size of the block forever, because as points sort of drop out of the traversal, they get added to this next block. So the block gets smaller and smaller. The rate at which that block gets smaller is completely input dependent. And what you actually want to size for is something like the typical block size, not the original block size. And what that means is that you have to know at runtime, once you see the input, what's going to happen. And so this is part of why we lose some performance, because we basically give up 5% of our runtime to find the best block size. So we spend 5% of our runtime running with suboptimal blocks. OK, so I talked to you about the scheduling transformation. Right? I can think about my computation as a bunch of operations that happen in some schedule. There's the initial schedule that is given to us by the programmer, right? And there's the new schedule that we come up with, right? So I've reordered the computations that are happening in a different order than they were before, which raises an obvious question, which is, are all schedules legal? Is it possible to just reorder these things willy-nilly and get whatever behavior I want, right? Can I get really good locality by just randomly reordering these things or reordering them in some disciplined ways? Is it always legal to do this? Right? Is it always legal to apply point blocking, for example? One thing that shows up in a lot of these benchmarks is that individual points are sort of independent of each other. Right? So having one point traverse the tree is different from having a second point traversing the tree. They don't really interact with each other. There's no dependencies from one traversal to another. In our original work, we showed that that is fine. As long as that's true, you can apply point blocking. The new schedule you get is fine. It will be sound. You'll get the same result. But it's actually not always true that multiple traversals of the tree don't interact with each other. Traversing the tree once can change the tree, which means that when I traverse the tree a second time, I see that changed tree. Is it still safe to reschedule the computation the way that I did? So let me give you literally a textbook example of when this might happen. Okay, so imagine that I have a binary search tree, right? Your standard like second semester data structures binary search tree. Okay, and I want to insert 2 new points into this binary search tree. Well, how do I do that? Well, I take point 10 and I sort of work my way down the tree and I build a new tree. And I take point 11 and I work my way down the tree and I build that, right? So that's 2 different recursive tree traversals. But they clearly interacted with each other. Point 11 had to be inserted after point 10 was because it needed to make itself the child of 10. Okay? So these are 2 traversals that interact with each other. Is it actually still safe to reschedule them the way that we did? And it turns out the answer is yes. It is still safe to reschedule them the way that we did, because here's what's going to happen. 10 and 11 merge together, right? They're in a single block, and they're working their way down the tree. When I get to node 12, 10 inserts itself, and 11 keeps going down, and then 11 inserts itself. Everything sort of works fine. What has happened here is that the first traversal, the traversal that inserted 10, performed its rights right before 11 actually needed to see that information, and so everything worked out fine. Right? I got exactly the right behavior. I got exactly the same tree, even though the traversals interact with each other. So the question is, can we come up with a more precise soundness test? And the analogy here would be loop interchange in regular programs. Loop interchange is safe as long as the loops are parallel, but it's also safe in other situations as well. You can have loop-carried dependencies, and you can still change the order of 2 loops, because not all dependencies break when I change the order of 2 loops. Similarly here, there was a dependence between those 2 traversals, but that dependence didn't break when I changed the order in which they executed, when I interleaved them together. So let's reason about dependencies. So let's take our really simple example, right? I'm just doing a traversal. Here's a simple tree with just a handful of nodes. And let's put up one of those iteration spaces again. I've turned it on its side just to confuse you, right? So now traversals are on the x-axis and nodes of the tree are on the y-axis. Okay? So here's an example of a potential iteration space. Here's a bunch of computations that have to happen. Here's the original order in which they happen. Right? Point 1 does its traversal, then point 2 does its traversal, etc. When I apply point blocking, this is the new order of computation that I get. All of points 1, 2, 3, and 4 visit node A, then they all visit node B, and so on. Right? So I've changed the order of computation. And the question is, has changing the order of computation broken any dependencies? Since it's interchanged the order, for example, of a read and a write that needed to happen in one way and now happen another way. Okay? So to reason about this, let's take a particular node. Right? Let's take a particular iteration. So this is point 2 visiting node C in the tree. Okay? Everything shaded in blue happened after this iteration in the original code, and happens after this iteration in the transformed code. Okay? What this means is that if I have a dependence from here to any of those iterations, so if this guy writes to something and say this guy reads from it, nothing is a problem. Right? Everything will work, right? Because the 2 iterations happen in a particular order in the original code and in the same order in the transformed code. Okay, is that always true? Is it always the case that 2 iterations that happened in one order in the original code still happen in the same order in the transformed code? Well, the answer is no. So consider iteration y. Okay, so imagine there's a dependence between these 2 iterations. So when point 2 is at node C, I write to a location, and then when point 3 is at node Y, I read from the same location. Okay? In the original code, point 2 did all of its work before I got to point 3. So the write happened before the read. In the transformed code, node B does all of its work before I move on to node C. So the read now happens after the write. I've changed the order of the reads and the writes. The code is broken. Okay? So it turns out that I can actually formalize this into a dependence test, into basically a constraint that says as long as this constraint is satisfied, everything is fine. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. Okay? So what I want to know is whether for all iterations, right, so for every one of these little circles, for every combination of a point and a node, right, so for every pair of iterations, is the following true? That if there's a dependence between the two iterations, right, so this is just some notation to say there's some dependence between the two iterations, and point I happened before point J, right, this is fine as long as node I happened before node J in the traversal order. Okay, so every time they access the same location, the ordering is okay. As long as this is true for all pairs of iterations, changing the order using point blocking is safe. I won't break any dependencies. Okay? Now, one little tricky thing is this condition here. So node I happens before node J in the traversal order. That's based on the traversal order, right? So the traversal order of the tree. That's actually a little bit hard to reason about because of the way sort of left children and right children interact with each other in the traversal order. So we're going to make this a little bit more conservative and say, OK, node I definitely happens before node J in the traversal order if node I is an ancestor of node J. Right, I'm doing a preorder traversal of the tree, so node I is definitely going to come before node J. So I'm going to simplify this. It'll make my life a lot easier. Okay? So as long as node I is either an ancestor of node J or is the same as node J, everything is hunky-dory. So how do I apply this dependence test? How can I take a piece of code and actually analyze it and tell it this is true? Right, that is the question that we wanted to answer. So to do this, we came up with something called tree dependence analysis. And what this does is it analyzes recursive methods over trees and basically tries to figure out whether these kinds of dependencies exist. Okay, so the intuition here is that every invocation of this recursive method, right, I'm calling recurse on an n and a p, so every invocation of this recursive method represents one pn iteration. Right? I have a particular point, I'm at a particular node in the tree. So I can write a pretty straightforward abstract interpretation that gathers what we call rooted access paths. And so what that says is, given the node I'm currently at in the tree, what parts of the tree am I accessing relative to where I currently am? Okay. So for example, this is actually a little piece of a binary tree insertion code. So I read n.v. I write to n.v. I read from n.l. I write to n.l.v. Right? So I can basically just gather this information. Okay. So I can take these access paths, and now I can think about applying my dependence test. I want to know whether for every pair of iterations, this is true. Right? This is OK. So what does that mean? Well, for a pair of iterations to have, remember, I'm talking about some arbitrary pi and ni. Right? I don't actually know what p is, and I don't know what n is. But I have information about what I'm going to access relative to a particular node in the tree. So this is possible. It's possible that I have two iterations that access the same location, and in a bad way, if I have two access paths that have a common suffix. They're accessing, so basically starting from the same n, they can get to the same part of the tree. Right? And at least one of them is a write. And then I again want to check for OK ordering. So for example, n.v and n.v, they've got a common suffix. Basically it says if one iteration is at node n, it's going to read from n.v. A different iteration node n, at the same node n will write to n.v, so they're going to access the same location. OK. Then, once I find that dependence, I can ask whether the prefixes, right? The prefixes tell me sort of relative where those accesses where those accesses are originating from. Okay. So here, in fact, the two accesses are originating from the same node in the tree. Two different points at the same node in the tree, both access n.v. So I can look at the prefixes to see if they violate the ancestry constraint, and well, it's the same node, so they clearly don't. So everything's OK. But what about this? n.v and n.l.v. Here, there's a common suffix with at least one write. There's a dependence. And n and n.l it turns out, do violate the ancestry constraint. To see why that is, let's talk about some specific examples. Okay? So suppose I have a point at node B writing to n.l.v, and a point at node C reading from n.v. Okay? So node B's left child is C, so these 2 points, when point 1 is down here and point 2 is up here, they clearly interfere with each other. Right? So let's actually just make that very concrete. B.l.v and C.v are the same location. Right? And the problem is that that second point gets to node B before the first point gets a chance to read from C.v, which means that I'm going to write to C.v before the first point gets to read from it. And so if I apply the transformation, I'm going to get the wrong answer. In the original code, I got to read from C.v and then write to B.l.v. In the transformed code, the accesses happen in the other order. OK. Now, this was for our binary search tree insertion code, which we actually know is correct. We know it's safe to apply point blocking to this code. We can actually insert multiple things into the tree at the same time. The question is why. To understand why, we actually added something to tree-dependent analysis we called a path-sensitive analysis. And the idea here is that there does appear to be this problematic dependence. Okay? I write to n.l.v, and I read from n.v. Right? But the thing is, I don't always write to n.l.v. I write to n.l.v under the following conditions, that b.v is less than pj.v. So I write to b.l.v when b.v is less than pj.v and b.l is equal to null. Right? If I sort of look at the conditions here, that access only happens sometimes, not all the time. Unfortunately, I do actually read from n.v all the time. Let's see. But even though I do read from n.v all the time, I read from c.v all the time, I only do that if I recurse down from b. I can only get to c if I started at b and called my recursive function here. And that recursive function doesn't get called all the time. Right? That recursive function only gets called under certain conditions, and so I can actually strengthen the condition under which that access happens. Okay, so I write to b.l.v when this is true. I read from b.l.v, or I read from c.v, remember they're the same location, when this is true. And it turns out they can't both be true at the same time. One guy wants b.l to be equal to null, and one guy wants b.l to not be equal to null. And so we just ask Z3 whether that's possible, and it basically says that this dependence can never happen. So here's how tree dependence analysis works. I write an abstract interpretation to collect all of the access paths in my program. Okay. I rule out access path pairs that have different suffixes. They can never actually create a dependence. I rule out access path pairs with compatible prefixes. These are access path pairs where even though the dependence exists, I'm at OK parts in the tree when they happen, so everything still works. And then I use our path-sensitive analysis to rule out more accesses. Right? They can't happen at the same time. Because of the conditional execution, because not all writes and reads happen every time, I can rule out circumstances when those dependencies might occur. And in fact, for this BST code, everything checks out. There are no dependencies left. Okay, we actually applied this to a bunch of different codes, including Barnes Hut octree building, KD tree building, skew heap insertion, a bunch of other sort of interesting things. And it all worked out. So now we have this dependence test that lets us prove whether point blocking is sound. And this is really sort of the first step along this path of coming up with a richer notion of dependences and reasoning about dependences and transformations that hopefully will let us start doing more of the really sophisticated things that you can do in the polyhedral world. OK. What else can we do? What other transformations can we do? Any questions about tree dependence analysis before I move on? Ross?
So the ancestor test, does it work for in-order traversals, or you are assuming?
The ancestor test requires a pre-order traversal. Mm-hmm. For in-order traversals, you basically, if you have in-order or post-order, the traversal ordering test needs to be changed. So post-order is pretty easy because you just sort of flip the order. In-order is tricky because now, again, you're back to reasoning about the differences between right and left, which we don't have a really good way to do, but I think we could probably make it happen. We just haven't encountered it yet.
So, okay, let me leave the second question for the end.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a bunch of tree traversal programs. They all seem really cool. We can do some fancy stuff with them. What if we want to vectorize them? Right? What if we want to do some vectorization? SIMD is actually pretty tricky for irregular programs, right? SIMD is this nice data parallel thing. It works really well when you have dense loops, right? So it works really well when I'm talking about, well, operating on vectors, right? It's vectorization. But this program is this sort of, so here's the point blocked program, right? So I applied point blocking to our code. And actually what's interesting is that this loop here is a dense loop, right? For each point in some little vector of points, do some work here, right? So this is actually a dense loop that could be amenable to vectorization, right? So here's a pretty natural idea. I'm just going to assign each of those traversals to a different SIMD lane and run them simultaneously. I'm going to vectorize that loop. Right? And that seems like it should work pretty well. Right? So why might it not work so well? Well, it might not work so well for actually the reason that, for the same reason that we have to do this auto-tuning thing, this runtime auto-tuning thing, which is that points that are in this block sort of drop out of the block as you traverse your way down the tree. As I make my way down the tree, not every point wants to go to the same parts of the tree as the other people in its block, and so they get removed, and this block actually gets pretty sparse. And sparse loops are not so much fun to vectorize, right? You can still vectorize them, but you spend a lot of time just masking out SIMD lanes. And that's not so good. Right? So traversals diverge in the tree, and this block of points becomes very sparse. We could try to use larger blocks to get around this, right? If we use very large blocks, then even as the block gets sparse, we can sort of compress them and make sure the blocks there's still enough work to do. But as the block gets bigger, as we saw before, as we talked about before, my cache performance gets worse. So I need to be able to use small blocks to get good cache performance. But if I use small blocks, the blocks get sparse, and I don't have enough work to SIMDize. Right? So there's this fundamental tension here. Right? Big blocks are great for SIMD, but bad for cache. Small blocks are great for cache, but bad for SIMD. Okay? So really the only way out of this knot is to build the blocks in a better way. Can I put points into these blocks so that they don't diverge? Can I put points into these blocks so they visit the same parts of the tree? Right? So that way I basically prevent points from dropping out of the block, and I prevent the block from getting sparse. Okay? So to do this, we have another transformation that we call traversal splicing. If point blocking was tiling the point loop and sending tiles of points through the tree, or blocks of points through the tree, traversal splicing goes the other way. It blocks the tree loop instead, or the tree loop in quotes, because that's actually a recursive traversal. Right? So rather than saying for each block of points, what if I said for every partial traversal, so for every piece of the tree, have every point that wants to visit that part of the tree visit that part of the tree. Okay? So now I've just sort of changed what loop is getting tiled. Okay? And now it's going to turn out that we can do something clever. So here's what traversal splicing does in practice. Okay, so here's my original computation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need to tile the tree, so let me just sort of cut the tree in half. We call these splice nodes. Okay, so C, F, H, and K. These are the places where we're going to cut traversals off. Right, so we're going to do these partial traversals. So step 1 is run the traversals, but stop them when they're done with that part of the tree. So run the traversals until they get to node C, and then stop. Okay. Then move on to the next tile. Right? So I'm going to take a tile of the tree, interact with it, then move to the next tile of the tree, interact with it. But because I've paused all these traversals at C, I can do something nice. Note that points 1, 3, and 5 made it to node C, and points 2 and 4 actually dropped out earlier. Right? I'm going to use this as a hint. Points 1, 3, and 5 making it to node C says that they're actually behaving pretty similarly so far, and points 2 and 4 clearly behave differently from 1, 3, and 5. So what if I just use that as a hint and reorder the points? Okay. So let me group points 1, 3, and 5 together, and then points 2 and 4. Points 1, 3, and 5 made it to the same node in the tree. Points 2 and 4 didn't. And then start again. So now I'm going to move on to node F. Okay. So what has happened here is that after I got done with this tile, I've essentially sort of examined what all the points did in this tile of the tree, in this partial traversal, and used that information to change the order of the points based on what they've done so far. Okay? And this reordering, actually you'll know, got us the original sort of sorted order that we wanted. 1, 3, and 5 were together, and 2 and 4 were together. So we restart the traversals, and we get better locality. But more importantly, we restart the traversals, and the new points that are near each other are doing very similar things. Okay? So this dynamic reordering sorts points based on their past behavior, and it's automatically grouping together points that behave similarly. And this really helps with vectorization. Okay? So this graph is a little bit hard to read. So let me quickly explain it. These are our benchmarks on the x-axis. On the y-axis, what we're showing is as you run the SIMD-ized version of the code, what percentage of SIMD lanes are you typically able to utilize? Right? So if you have 4 SIMD lanes and there are 4 points in the block, you can use all the SIMD lanes. If there's only 2 points in the block, you're using 50% of the SIMD lanes. And so we sort of sum this up over the entire execution. And in our baseline, we get pretty bad utilization, sometimes around 50%. In something like nearest neighbor, where points really disperse in the tree, you get basically no benefit from SIMD at all. The blocks become incredibly sparse very quickly. Okay? If we try to do some sort of a priori sort, right, so some application-specific knowledge, do a bit of sorting, we can actually do pretty well. Right? We get pretty high SIMD utilization. If we do our dynamic sorting, completely automatic, we actually do really well. We get really good utilization, sometimes very close to the ideal utilization, the best you could possibly do in terms of utilization. In fact, for some of our benchmarks, we actually get better utilization than the a priori sort. Our dynamic sort, because it's constantly changing the order of the points, does a better job of finding an order than if I had to sort ahead of time. Right? So we get really good SIMD utilization as a result of this. Alan?
So how do you define ideal in this case?
Ideal in this case basically says, so the way we measure SIMD utilization basically says take the block of points that has made it to this node in the tree, break it up into chunks of SIMD width. Right? Every chunk of full SIMD width gets counted as perfect utilization for that chunk, and anything that's sort of left over gets counted against our sort of utilization. So if you have 5 points and there's a SIMD width of 4, you get 1 block of perfect utilization and 1 block of 25% utilization. Right? So what this means is that if I use larger and larger and larger blocks, then I am always getting as many points as possible that want to visit this part of the tree, because I've looked at the entire set of points. I've set all the points together. If any points wanted to visit this part of the tree, they're going to get there at the same time. So that basically says the maximum possible utilization I could get at this point in the tree. So what ideal does is it takes a block that is equal to the entire input set and runs it through the tree and computes the same thing. Basically says if you could do a perfect job, what would you get? Right, but this is an unrealistically large block. Okay. So when we put it all together, this is now in C++ instead of Java. Traversal splicing lets us use small blocks. We can use these smaller blocks and use traversal splicing to keep the blocks dense. And when we put it all together, on average, we get about a 3x speed up. This is on 4 wide SIMD. And this is from a combination of better caching, because we're able to do point blocking and stuff, and better SIMD utilization. So this is using traversal splicing, this other kind of tiling, and then applying that to vectorization to get very efficient vectorization for tree programs. The quote that I like to use, there's something I like to point out here. One of our benchmarks, this PM benchmark, which we got about maybe a 2x speed up in our best case. This PM benchmark is a ray tracer. And there's been a lot of work on vectorizing ray tracers, using actually sort of similar approaches. I want to take a bunch of rays that are going in similar directions and group them together. But for certain kinds of situations, that doesn't work very well because the rays bounce all over the place and they move all over the place. So there was this quote from a Pixar paper that basically said, this might not actually be the best way to do vectorization. It seems like it's really hard to find things that are doing similar work in order to vectorize them, and that's kind of exactly what we wind up doing. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about something that got a little bit, that is surprisingly related, even though it might not seem to be. Yeah, Dan.
This is all fantastic, and just so that you can graduate more PhD students and have more to do. Right now that you're changing these algorithms, it's not clear you should build the same tree to start with, right?
That's right. So you might actually be better off with a different kind of tree. That's definitely something that we want.
Or even a same, it's still a KD tree or whatever it is, but just you make different choices.
And I think that's definitely something to look at. We have not looked at that yet. Changing the data structure is a much more aggressive change to the code than changing the traversal.
Yeah, even if you did it manually, right? Is there some other set of heuristics on how you build the KD tree? How deep do you want it to be? How balanced? How bushy?
They're definitely that make this better.
Well, or that in the old world, there were certain rules of thumb developed painfully over many years, and now in this new world, some of those are wrong.
Yeah, I think that, yes, that the answer is yes, but I don't actually know what the answer is. I don't know what the right thing to do is. But we've definitely seen that once we've started applying our techniques, sort of rules of thumb about which kinds of trees you should use for which applications. So it's not even changing, it's been a little bit more simplistic, but changing from KD trees to a different kind of tree entirely has turned out to work really well. But that's a big, this is not really an algorithmic change. I'm just sort of rescheduling the existing algorithm, depending on how you want to think about this. Changing the tree is really a much more invasive change. But yes, we have found that once you're doing these kinds of optimizations where it matters a lot how similar consecutive traversals are, for example, or how likely it is that two traversals are going to stay together in the tree, once you're doing these kinds of optimizations, different trees have turned out to work better. Yeah. I don't have any new rule of thumb yet. But okay, so this was a sort of a different problem that we were looking at that turned out to be very closely related, somewhat surprisingly. So if anybody's familiar with Silk, it's sort of one of the canonical one of like the most popular ways of writing task parallel programs. It's basically fork join parallelism. And the way a Silk program works is I have a function, and then if I have another function that I want to execute, I can spawn it off instead of just calling it, and that basically just runs it. Effectively, think about it as running it in another thread. Right? Silk itself is more complicated than that, but for our purposes, that's a reasonable way to think of where this parallelism is coming from. Okay? And a lot of Silk programs have this nice recursive nature where the spawned functions are doing, it's the same function as the original calling function, just with a different thing. So I'm just taking a recursive program and spawning off the recursive calls instead of just calling them. This is basically a skeleton of Fibonacci. So we want to execute these things on vector machines, right? Because, well, Silk was sort of designed to do multi-core processing, right? It's great for SMPs, shared memory multiprocessor machines. But now we have all these machines that have SIMD. And it's basically free parallelism sitting there for the taking if we can take advantage of it. So we want to be able to run these kinds of programs on SIMD if we can, take advantage of SIMD if possible. The problem is that Silk programs are fundamentally task parallel. I'm looking for independent tasks that I can spawn off and run in parallel. SIMD is fundamentally data parallel. I'm looking for the same computation over different pieces of data. Right? And I'm looking basically for big vectors of computation that I can then march through in a nice SIMD way. So what we want to do is expose data parallelism in task parallel programs so that we can take these task parallel programs and run them with SIMD. So first, let's talk about how to generate data parallelism. Okay. Intuitively, actually, there's a tremendous amount of data parallelism in recursive task parallel programs because if you think about what happens as I spawn off these tasks, I'm recursively spawning off more and more and more tasks. And so I just have a bunch of these independent tasks that if I could just put them together into a vector, that's data parallel, right? It's just for each task, do some work, right? So can I do this efficiently? So the regular execution, if I were to execute this code sequentially, it's depth first. It's a depth first execution of this computation. I can sort of imagine what I have here as a computation tree. Every time I make a recursive call, I'm spawning off a child of this tree. And regular sequential execution is the depth first exploration of this computation tree. When I get to the base case, that's a leaf. Okay? So we can apply a transformation that takes these recursive programs and does a breadth first execution instead. Okay, it's very similar to the point blocking transformation. What I'm going to do is create a task block, right, a set of tasks, and then for each task, I run the task code. If I want to spawn off children tasks, I just add them to the next task block, and then I call my next task block. Right, so I'm basically just creating a task block, and think about it as taking horizontal slices of the computation tree and treating that as a task block. Okay? And this is fantastic. This is very SIMDizable because this is a nice, dense computation. The base cases can be all SIMDized. It's the same code executing over different pieces of data. Right? Great for SIMDization. Right? In fact, that was where we started. But there's a problem with this. There's actually a reason. So Silk, even though it's a parallel processing system, tries very hard to still do depth-first explorations of the computation tree instead of ever going in any other direction. And the reason is that if you do anything other than depth-first execution, for example, if you do breadth-first execution, you run into some really bad space problems. Okay, so how big are these task blocks? These task blocks are horizontal slices of the tree which means they are equivalent to the width of the computation tree. The width of that computation tree is exponential. So this is really not so good. Right? We can't actually execute this code. In fact, we tried to execute code like this on the Xeon Phi, and we just ran out of memory. Right? The task blocks just get too big. Okay? So we need to somehow control the space usage. Well, here's one thing that we could try to do. Once the block gets too big, once I'm sort of running out of space, I can switch back to depth-first execution. Right? So I can say, call DFS foo instead, a depth-first version of the code that for every task just calls the original depth-first program. Right? So now I've stopped generating more work. Right? I'm going to execute in depth-first mode. I stop using more space, and that's great. But this loop, unlike the previous loop, is really hard to vectorize, because now I'm back to having all this recursion in there. Well, what is this loop? This is a repeated recursive code. So we can actually just apply point blocking to it and get something that looks like this. And our new DFS foo takes that task block, and for each block of tasks applies the base case, and then defers the recursive execution, and then calls the recursive version of the code. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do breadth-first execution, generating these big task blocks, this nice vectorizable block of code to execute. Then, at some point, I'm going to switch over to depth-first execution and apply our point blocking transformation to get more vectorizable execution, and just keep going. So I can just keep vectorizing without making these task blocks too big. And what's interesting is that if these task blocks get too small, if too many of these guys don't want to continue execution, so this task block is getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of breadth first, then when I switch to depth first, the task blocks actually get smaller as I hit base cases. So I can just switch back to breadth first at some point and make the task blocks bigger again. So I'm basically constantly sort of making task blocks bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller, and at all times, I have code that looks like this. For each task in a vector of tasks, do the same piece of work, so I can vectorize. So we applied this transformation to 8 different recursive task parallel programs. This was vectorization, happened through a combination of auto-vectorization. We used some intrinsics in places where the Intel compiler just had some trouble like realizing that if conversion could work and stuff like that. We get an average speedup of 2.58x. In the best case, we get about a 9x speedup. So this is taking sequential Silk programs, or sequential programs that were Silk programs, but the baseline here is actually single-threaded code, not Silk code. So if you're familiar with Silk, just running under Silk slows you down. But this is the single-threaded code without Silk. And we just vectorize it using these transformations, and we get this kind of speed up. OK, so to wrap things up, irregular algorithms that deal with pointer-based data structures of various sorts, are a fertile ground for locality and parallelism optimizations. There's a lot of pretty low-hanging fruit here, right? Stuff that we can take advantage of, because these data structures, these applications have lots of reuse and lots of potential for parallelism, but they are often written in pretty simple ways. The sort of obvious way to write them does not expose all the locality that you might want, does not expose all the parallelism you might want. So they're a really nice target to optimize. But we have found that in order to really get a good handle on how to optimize them, we need to sort of consider them at the right level of abstraction. We need to think about them in terms of iteration spaces, in terms of regularly reoccurring patterns, in terms of the regular pieces of computation that appear inside the irregular programs. And that winds up informing the transformations that we develop. It informs the correctness criteria that we come up with, informs our reasoning about locality effects, et cetera. And ultimately, we came up with a whole bunch of different kinds of transformations that essentially regularize the computation to get us better locality and parallelism. And so we just wrap up by thanking students and collaborators.
Thank you. So one thing I was curious about, it's really nice how you sort of have constructed all these analogs, sort of like the old school Fortran optimizations. So one that I looked at in the past that I thought was really neat was software pipelining. Yeah, we sort of smear the iteration. You smear like the body across iterations. Is there an analog of that here?
So I've thought a little bit about this. The closest one that we can that I have thought of, which is not exactly the same as software pipelining. There's a transformation you can do for regular programs called loop skewing, which is doing a similar kind of smearing, except in a sort of more regular software pipelining. Sort of mixes different pieces of computations up together. Loop skewing sort of tilts the iteration space. So what it does is if you were to then parallelize it, you would get something that looks a little bit more like software pipelining.
Oh, so you're still breaking dependencies, but you're not sort of setting up so that like the next iteration, it's not like sort of stages, it's just you're tilting it to break dependencies, you're not necessarily setting up a pipeline.
That's right. But you could then do something that looks more like software pipelining if you unroll the inner loop. That actually winds up looking like software pipelining. So the equivalent of loop skewing here would be something like one traversal. So it maybe doesn't work in this full point blocking setting, but imagine I've got one guy that's going, to my left and my right, and so on. I can imagine doing the equivalent of what's called loop peeling, which says sort of peel off the first iteration. So what I'm going to do is the first iteration of one traversal is actually going to do the work that should have been done for both the left child and the right child. Then I move down to my left child and do the work that should have been done for the left child and the right child. So I'm sort of pulling up all of the work, and then I can merge it together with somebody that has not done that. And so I'm sort of taking work from a later iteration and merging it with work from an earlier iteration, which I think is, in the way I think about this, is kind of an analog of what's
Yeah. I mean, that's so normally, right? Like you need loop peeling to like prime the pipeline anyway, right. And all. So it's like this is the right flavor. That makes sense. Cool.
I like the analogies here. I'm always a little bit wary about analogies because it's very, analogies are nice for explanation and thinking about correspondences, but it's very easy to fall into the trap of sort of overlearning from the analogy. So I think this works. I think that there are some differences between what you actually ultimately want to do in loop skewing and software pipelining and what I just mentioned here, but they're similar.
I mean, they did so much stuff in the old days with all these loop nests, and you'd say, look at the problem like loop nests again. What can we mine from that?
No, I mean that's pretty much exactly how this works. Yeah. It's been pretty fertile.
So I guess maybe following up on that, are there any classic optimizations in this analogy that actually were worse in the irregular setting?
Well, we haven't thought about all of them yet.
Sure.
There are a bunch that I think. So there's a bunch of classic optimizations that, in isolation, are not actually necessarily useful. So loop skewing, for example, in isolation is not necessarily useful. Loop reversal in isolation is not necessarily useful. And so the analog of loop reversal, by the way, so loop reversal says instead of going from 0 to n, go from n down to 0. One analog for loop reversal is switching from a pre-order to a post-order traversal. It sort of reverses the directions that you're visiting everything. And then if you also switch the left and the right children, now you've completely reversed the loop. So anyway, there's some of those where we don't yet know how they might turn out to be handy.
Right.
If you want to, because ultimately what constrains us is the thing I've sort of briefly mentioned, which is I can come up with all sorts of schedules, and I can come up with all sorts of ways of telling you that the schedule is safe, but ultimately I do need to be able to generate code that executes that schedule. Trying to do this, I mean, you could imagine a completely generic runtime system where you feed it a schedule and it goes off and does it, but that's not likely to be very efficient. So ultimately, I need to be able to generate code that implements this schedule, and there's a lot of really crazy transformations that you can do in the regular space, where I just don't know what the analog code representation might be in the irregular space. And in fact, I mean, I would argue that that was one of the things that for a while kind of held back the polyhedral system. Like I could do all these really fancy things about I can combine fusion and tiling and skewing and all this stuff, and I get these crazy things. But you needed something like Klug to actually go off and generate the code for you. And code generation was a big stumbling block for a long time. And I think that's, for some of these transformations, that's kind of where we are.
You give one example of this point correlation.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what kind of applications would be,
So the other applications we've looked at are, so nearest, there's a bunch of different nearest neighbor searches, and Dan actually left, but there's a bunch of different nearest neighbor searches that use different kind of trees that are optimized for different things, depending on exactly what kind of data you're looking at. So they all look like this.
So I'm thinking about a bunch of data structures used in, say, compilers.
That's right, so ASC traversals, right, are a great example of these kinds of things.
People use binary decision diagrams, points to sets.
Right. So BDDs are a little bit, potentially a little trickier, but yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of these kinds of tree structures that you're traversing. Some of the stuff so actually point blocking, the original optimization, generalizes to DAGs and graphs without any trouble. The other transformations are a little more squirrely. But there's a lot of applications where, for example, what you're doing is you have a graph or you have a DAG, but you're ultimately traversing a spanning tree. And so it still looks tree-like at runtime. And so then again, you might be able to do some of these things. Recursive traversals are everywhere. Other applications we've looked at, so we've looked at, like I mentioned, a couple of ray tracers that do this kind of thing for ray object intersection tests or for ray casting, things like that.
I just imagine it would be interesting to apply this to, say, GCC and the LLVM.
I have a student who's looking. The code bases are
what they are.
So the creation of the dependence test and the iteration
Yeah.
space for arrays is amazing. Something that I wouldn't believe you can do. So since you thought a lot about this,
yeah.
how to phrase it as dependencies, and do you have an idea under what conditions we could just forget these dependencies and say all these alternatives are enumerable and just do bounded model checking and believe that this gives you a complete proof?
Right. So the completeness aspect, I mean, in some sense, that's kind of what we're doing in our path dependence analysis, because what we're essentially saying is, because I know the dependencies have at most a certain depth, I can essentially unroll the code to see the full dependence and then prove that this thing isn't going to happen.
But it has the limitations that all dependence techniques have, that you consider the statements to be immutable black boxes, and all you can do is reorder them.
That's right.
Now, this is probably okay, but like for the rotation, right? Like 3 rotations.
Yeah.
Maybe it would help you if you really analyze the effect of the entire code rather than reordering of those statements.
Yeah.
And I think that you can definitely bound how deep the dependencies go, which means that I can potentially say that once I have a sufficiently large tree, all the dependencies that could arise, or the types of dependencies that could arise, will be seen. And so I might be able to do something. You might be able to do something.
Right, the idea of dependence distance. If
That's
you
right. That's exactly.
Say maybe that my block is big enough.
That's right.
That I'm
gonna. That's right. The dependence distance is at most 3 or something. My block is big enough to see that dependence. And that's, like I said, that's kind of exactly what we're taking advantage of. Probably not as much as we could, right? In our path dependence thing, we're taking advantage of exactly that, which is that if I go to n.l.r, right, and that's where my dependence is, I know that I need to unroll twice. But the sort of analog of that is that I know that if I have a tree that's of at least that's of depth 3, I'm going to see that dependence.
Well, thank you very much for the
Yeah.